At 58, Evelyn Mercer was running 640 acres of Kansas wheat almost entirely alone. Waking before sunrise, repairing whatever she could with her own hands, and pretending she didn't notice that her son's bedroom had remained untouched for 3 years. Her husband, Daniel, was dead. Her only son, Luke, had left Redfield for Denver after a bitter argument. And the last words Evelyn had thrown at him still haunted the farmhouse. "Then maybe you were never meant to have it." Everyone around her could see what Evelyn refused to admit: the farm was becoming too much for one person. Her combine was aging. Seasonal workers were harder to find. Expenses kept rising, and neighboring farmers quietly suggested she lease the land before pride cost her everything. But Evelyn made a decision that seemed almost unreasonable. She would harvest the entire farm herself and prove that the Mercer land did not need the son who had walked away from it. Some neighbors called her stubborn. Others said she was protecting a way of life the next generation had already abandoned. Then, just as the wheat became ready and a violent storm system began moving toward Redfield, Evelyn's combine broke down in the middle of the field. With hundreds of acres still standing and almost no time left, she went into Daniel's old workshop searching for a repair note. Instead, inside a maintenance ledger she had used for years, Evelyn found an envelope her husband had hidden before his death. It contained documents connected to Luke, Denver, and a decision Daniel had apparently made without ever telling her. Beneath those papers was a single handwritten note. Evelyn recognized her husband's handwriting immediately. She read the first line and suddenly understood that the story she had told herself about why her son abandoned the farm might have been wrong from the beginning. But before we reveal what Daniel wrote, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Whether you're starting your morning, working through the afternoon, or listening late at night. I hope your day brings you something good. And if you enjoy emotional stories about family, rural life, difficult choices, and the secrets ordinary people leave behind, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next story. Now, let's return to Mercer Farm, where Evelyn believed she was about to lose a harvest without knowing that before the storm arrived, the people she thought had abandoned Redfield were about to come down that country road. Evelyn Mercer woke at 4:47 without an alarm. At 58, her body had learned the farm's schedule too well to need one. She dressed in the dark, made coffee, and stood at the kitchen window while the first gray light spread over 640 acres of Kansas wheat. Daniel had once stood beside her there, talking through the day's work before either of them finished a cup. 4 years after his death, Evelyn still sometimes turned with a thought meant for him. The chair beside the table remained empty. Upstairs, another room was empty too. Luke's bedroom had barely changed since he left Redfield 3 years earlier. Evelyn told herself she simply had no reason to rearrange it. The truth was harder to name. She finished her coffee and went outside. Harvest was approaching, and the wheat had begun turning the deep gold she waited for every year. She checked a fence line, inspected the fuel tank, then walked through the machine shed with Daniel's old maintenance ledger tucked beneath her arm. The cover was stained with grease, and years of notes filled its pages. Belt replacements, oil changes, part numbers, dates. Evelyn had added her own handwriting after Daniel died. The combine worried her most. It was old enough to have moods. During the previous week, she had noticed a vibration that came and went near the header drive. She had tightened what she could and convinced herself the sound was normal. Ray Collins arrived shortly after 7 in a dusty pickup. At 64, he had farmed the neighboring land almost as long as Daniel had. He listened while Evelyn started the combine, then frowned. "You hear that?" "I hear an engine." "You hear something you don't want to hear." Evelyn shut it down. "It ran last season." "So did my knees." Ray crouched near the drive assembly and examined it. "I'd have somebody look at this before harvest." "I am somebody. You're also one person running 640 acres. Evelyn closed the engine panel harder than necessary. Ray did not argue. He had learned when to stop. "Call me if it gets worse." "It won't. Machines appreciate confidence." He drove away toward his own fields. Evelyn returned to the farmhouse near noon and found a missed call from Luke. She stared at his name before calling back. He answered from Denver on the fourth ring. "Hey, Mom, you called? Just checking in." They discussed weather first, then his work. Luke asked whether harvest had started. Evelyn said soon. Neither mentioned whether he planned to come home. She almost asked. The question reached the back of her throat and stayed there. 3 years had passed since their argument, but she could still hear his final accusation as clearly as if he were standing in the kitchen. "Dad chose this farm. You chose this farm. I never did." "Everything okay there?" Luke asked. Evelyn looked through the window toward the machine shed. "Everything's fine." After they hung up, she remained at the table with the phone in her hand. She hated how polite they had become. Politeness was what people used when they no longer knew which subjects were safe. That afternoon, she carried Daniel's ledger back to the shed and reviewed the combine's maintenance history. His handwriting filled the older pages, compact and practical. Evelyn ran her thumb over one entry without reading it. The book felt like the closest thing she had to asking him what to do. She checked the belts again, greased the fittings, and decided to test the combine along the edge of a field. The engine settled into its familiar roar for several minutes. Everything behaved exactly as it should. Evelyn felt vindicated. Ray worried too much. The farm had survived Daniel's death. It had survived Luke leaving. It would survive another harvest. Then the vibration returned. This time it traveled through the steering column into her hands. Evelyn reduced speed. The sound disappeared. She moved forward again. A sharp metallic crack came from beneath the front assembly. Evelyn immediately stopped. Dust drifted past the windshield. For a moment, there was only the idling engine and the wheat moving in the Kansas wind. Then, from somewhere inside the combine, came a slow, grinding noise she had never heard before. Evelyn shut the combine down and called Ray. He arrived 20 minutes later with tools in the bed of his pickup and no trace of satisfaction at being right. Together they opened the front assembly. Ray inspected the drive components while Evelyn held a flashlight. "Nothing catastrophic yet," he finally said. "I dislike the word yet." "Then you won't like the rest." A worn bearing and damaged drive components needed replacement before harvest pushed the machine hard. It could be repaired, but not cheaply. Ray wrote down the part numbers and told her which shop to call. By afternoon, Evelyn had an estimate. She stared at the number on her kitchen table beside fuel bills and seasonal labor costs. "Highway robbery," she muttered. Ray, drinking coffee across from her, shrugged. "Cheaper than destroying the whole assembly." "That's not comforting." "Wasn't meant to be." He reminded her that Daniel would have repaired it before harvest. Evelyn knew that. Daniel had believed machines usually warned people before they failed. Ignoring the warning was a choice. His absence seemed sharpest in moments like this. When a practical problem became hers alone, Luke could probably diagnose it. Ray said. Evelyn's expression stopped him. "I wasn't suggesting anything." Good. 3 years earlier, Luke had still been working beside her. He could strip a gearbox, weld a broken bracket, and hear an engine problem before Evelyn noticed it. She had taken those skills as proof that the farm belonged in his future. Luke had seen them differently. Their last argument began over dinner after Evelyn mentioned expanding grain storage for when you take over. Luke put down his fork. We need to stop saying that. Evelyn had thought he meant the expense. Then he told her he wanted to leave Redfield. Denver had jobs connected to industrial equipment and engineering work. He wanted something that was his. Evelyn had been exhausted, still raw from Daniel's death, and terrified of losing another person. Instead of saying any of that, she accused Luke of walking away from everything his father built. Luke's face hardened. Dad chose this farm. You chose this farm. I never did. The sentence struck exactly where she was weakest. Evelyn answered before she could stop herself. Then maybe you were never meant to have it. Luke left Redfield soon afterward. They spoke now, but carefully. Neither had apologized enough to erase that night. Ray finished his coffee and stood. Order the parts. Evelyn nodded. After he left, a white pickup turned into the drive. Hannah Collins stepped out carrying a tablet and soil testing equipment. Ray's 27-year-old daughter had left Redfield for college before returning as an agricultural consultant. She had been checking crop conditions for several local farms. They walked into the wheat together. Hannah tested moisture and examined several heads. You're getting close, she said. Another stretch of dry weather and you'll be moving. Evelyn looked toward the machine shed. Assuming the combine cooperates. Hannah had already heard. In Redfield, mechanical trouble traveled almost as quickly as weather forecasts. You could line up backup harvesting. Everyone will be cutting their own wheat. Worth asking? Evelyn pulled a head of wheat through her fingers. When I was your age, people didn't need convincing to stay and work the family place. Hannah glanced at her. Some did, not like now. Maybe they just didn't talk about leaving. Evelyn knew where the conversation was going. Luke couldn't get away fast enough. Hannah's voice remained gentle. Leaving isn't always the same as rejecting where you came from. Easy for you to say, you came back. Because I was allowed to decide whether I wanted to, Evelyn said nothing. That evening. After ordering the combine parts, she opened Daniel's maintenance ledger to record the repair. His old entries filled the pages before hers. She remembered something Ray had once mentioned, casually, Luke asking Daniel about technical training before Daniel died. At the time, Evelyn had assumed it concerned agricultural equipment. Now she wondered. She turned several pages backward. A folded corner caught her attention. Daniel had deliberately marked the page. Most of it contained ordinary maintenance notes. Near the bottom, however, he had drawn a short line beside an entry Evelyn had never noticed. There was no explanation, only 2 words. See envelope. Evelyn searched the ledger pocket, but it was empty. She turned the marked page back and forth, looking for anything she had missed. Below the maintenance figures, faint beneath a grease smear, Daniel had written one more notation. It contained Luke's name. Evelyn carried Daniel's maintenance ledger into the kitchen and placed it beneath the brightest light. The notation under the grease smear was still difficult to read. She cleaned the plastic ruler she used as a bookmark and held it beneath the line. Luke Denver program call Monday. She read it 3 times. Daniel had written dates beside nearly every maintenance entry, and this page was no exception. The notation was made months before his death. Evelyn sat down. Luke had told her he wanted Denver only after Daniel was gone. At least that was what she had believed. She searched the ledger again for the envelope Daniel had referenced. The inside pocket was empty. She checked the drawer where he used to keep receipts, then the metal file box in the office. Nothing. By midnight. Evelyn had created a mess of old warranties, seed invoices, equipment manuals, and tax records without finding an envelope connected to Luke. She finally stopped because there was work waiting before sunrise. The next morning brought another problem. Marcus Reed, who managed the local grain purchasing operation, arrived while Evelyn was checking the repaired section of the combine. The replacement parts had been ordered, but the expense still bothered her. Marcus asked about the crop, then looked toward the machine shed. "Heard you're putting money into the combine again." "Apparently, my machinery has its own publicist." Small town. Marcus did not criticize her. Instead, he raised an option he had mentioned once before. Several younger operators nearby were looking for additional acreage to lease. Evelyn could retain ownership of Mercer Farm while allowing someone else to work most of the land. "I'm 58, Marcus, not 90. I didn't say you couldn't farm. You implied it. I said you don't have to farm all 640 acres alone." Evelyn ended the conversation politely but quickly. Leasing felt too close to surrender. Daniel had spent his life building the farm. She had promised herself it would continue after them for years. That future had contained Luke so naturally she had never considered asking whether he saw the same picture. Hannah arrived later to check the wheat again. Evelyn mentioned Marcus's proposal with more irritation than she intended. Hannah listened before saying, "Leasing doesn't mean losing the farm. It means someone else works it." "Yes, exactly." Hannah crouched and examined a wheat head. "Ownership and operation aren't the same thing." "That's a consultant's answer. It's also how some family farms survive." Evelyn looked across the field. The thought of another person's equipment crossing Mercer land made her uncomfortable. Daniel wanted this place to last after us. Did he say how Evelyn almost answered immediately? Then she thought of the ledger. Daniel had often talked about keeping the farm strong enough for the next generation. Evelyn had translated that into a specific future. Luke in the combine. Luke making planting decisions. Luke raising children in the farmhouse. Had Daniel actually said those things? Or had she filled in the details herself after Hannah left? Evelyn checked the farm accounts. The repair bills sat beside projected fuel costs and the wages she expected to pay during harvest. Seasonal workers were harder to secure because neighboring operations needed the same people at the same time. None of the numbers were disastrous alone. Together, they made the margin uncomfortable. She closed the folder and returned to Daniel's ledger. This time she searched by date instead of subject. Around the Denver notation were ordinary entries about hydraulic fluid, a belt replacement, and a service appointment. Nothing explained why Daniel had written Luke's name. Evelyn remembered Luke asking his father questions about technical training. She had assumed father and son were discussing equipment certification that would benefit the farm. Perhaps they had been discussing something else entirely. She considered calling Luke, then put the phone down. Their last conversation had been civil. She was not ready to turn the next one into an interrogation. Ray stopped by that evening to confirm the replacement combine parts should arrive soon. Evelyn showed him the notation. "Did Daniel ever mention this Denver program to you?" Ray adjusted his glasses and studied the page. "No details. But he mentioned something. I remember Luke talking about training. Daniel didn't seem bothered by it. Training here." Ray hesitated. "I don't know, Evelyn." That hesitation bothered her more than an answer would have. After Ray left, she walked to the machine shed and stood beside the combine. Daniel had taught Luke to operate it before he could legally drive on the highway. She remembered watching them together and assuming she was seeing the future. Daniel had apparently been looking at the same sun and seeing more possibilities than she knew. Back in the kitchen, Evelyn opened the ledger again and examined the date beside the notation. She compared it with the calendar she had kept from Daniel's final year, still stored with household records. There was no mistake. Luke Denver program call Monday had been written nearly 5 months before Daniel's fatal heart attack. Evelyn leaned back in her chair. Luke had not suddenly decided to leave after his father died. Daniel had known about Denver while he was alive. More than that, the word call suggested he had been helping with it for the first time. Evelyn wondered whether the future she believed Daniel wanted for their son had ever been Daniel's plan at all. Evelyn waited until evening to call Luke because she wanted the question to sound calmer than it felt. He answered from Denver after several rings. "Hey, Mom, I found something in your father's maintenance ledger." Silence. "Not long, but long enough." "What did you find?" "A note about a Denver program, written 5 months before he died." Luke exhaled. "I wondered if you ever saw that." The admission tightened something in her chest. So he knew. Yes. How long? A while. And neither of you thought to tell me Dad was helping me figure out the application? Evelyn stood from the kitchen table and began pacing. Helping you leave the farm? Helping me apply for technical training? In Denver? Yes. Same difference. Luke's voice hardened. No. Mom? It isn't. Evelyn looked through the window toward the wheat fields darkening beyond the yard. You let me think you decided all of this after he died. I decided before. And your father supported it? He listened. The word struck harder than she expected, meaning I didn't. Luke was quiet. Dad listened before he decided what my life should be. Evelyn's hand tightened around the phone. I spent 30 years building something for you. That's the problem. Excuse me? You built it for me without ever asking whether I wanted it. The old argument returned with frightening ease. Evelyn felt herself reaching for the same defenses. Your father worked himself to death for this place. This farm is our family. People would give anything to inherit land like this. She stopped before saying them. Why didn't Daniel tell me you'd have heard it as betrayal? Maybe because it was. Luke laughed once, without humor. There, that's why. Evelyn ended the call before she said something worse. The silence afterward felt different from the usual emptiness of the farmhouse. This time it felt crowded with things Daniel and Luke had shared without her. She told herself anger was justified. They had hidden a decision that affected the future of Mercer Farm. Yet underneath the anger was a more painful possibility. Maybe they had hidden it because they already knew how she would react. Ray arrived the next morning to check whether the combine parts had come in. Evelyn told him about the call. Daniel knew Luke wanted Denver, she said. Apparently everyone knew except me. I didn't know details, but you knew enough. Ray leaned against the pickup. Daniel asked me something once. Evelyn waited. He asked if I thought a farm failed when a kid didn't stay. She stared at him. What did you say? I said farms fail for a lot of reasons. Kids leaving isn't always one of them. And what did Daniel say? Not much. Said he didn't want Luke thinking the land was a debt. Evelyn looked away. The words did not sound like Daniel as she had remembered him. Yet they fit too easily with the ledger note. Ray did not press. He loved this farm. Evelyn said, nobody's saying he didn't. He always talked about keeping it in the family. Keeping land in a family and keeping a son on land aren't exactly the same thing. Evelyn hated how reasonable everyone had become. Later, Hannah came to inspect the wheat. Some sections were ripening unevenly after a stretch of variable heat, which meant harvest timing would be less convenient than Evelyn wanted. Hannah recommended watching moisture closely and being ready to move quickly when the window opened. Weather doesn't care about family arguments, she said. Evelyn almost smiled. Apparently neither does wheat. They walked the field together. Evelyn asked whether Hannah's father had ever expected her to return to Redfield. He hoped, Hannah said, but he didn't make it a condition. Condition of what? Of belonging. Evelyn stopped walking. Hannah seemed to realize she had stepped into something personal. Sorry. No, keep going. I left because I needed to know coming back would be my choice. Evelyn looked across the grain. And if you hadn't come back, I'd still be his daughter. The answer stayed with her long after Hannah left. That evening, Evelyn checked the forecast before bed. A large storm system was forming farther west. The first projections were uncertain, but the timing caught her attention. If the system strengthened, it could reach Redfield during the same narrow period when the wheat would be ready. She refreshed the forecast twice. Heavy rain, strong winds, possible severe thunderstorms. Evelyn looked toward Daniel's ledger on the table, then at Luke's name written in his father's hand. For years, she had believed the biggest threat to Mercer Farm was the generation that wanted to leave it. Now, with harvest approaching and weather building beyond the horizon, she was beginning to understand that the farm had never promised to wait for anyone's version of the future. By the next morning, the forecast had become less forgiving. The storm system had strengthened overnight, and the models now placed Redfield inside a likely path of heavy rain and high winds. Evelyn stood in the kitchen with coffee in one hand and her phone in the other, watching the weather map pulse red across western Kansas. The wheat was almost ready, but not all of it had reached the same moisture level. Waiting too long risked lodging and storm damage. Cutting too early meant grain that might not store well. Hannah arrived before 8 with a moisture meter and walked several sections of the field. "You can start on the driest ground tomorrow," she said. "Maybe this afternoon if the sun holds. And the rest? You'll have to move fast." How fast? Hannah glanced toward the western horizon. Faster than you'd like. Evelyn had already tried hiring additional seasonal help. 2 workers she had used in previous years were committed elsewhere. Another had taken a full-time job in town. Ray could help only in short stretches because his own crop was entering the same window. Every farm around Redfield was racing the same clock. The combine repairs were finished, but Evelyn no longer trusted the machine completely. The new components had solved the worst vibration, yet it still ran hotter than she liked. "Keep watching the temperature," Ray told her when he stopped by. "If it climbs, shut down." "If I shut down every time something worries you, I'll harvest in December." "Machines don't care about your schedule." "Neither does the storm." Ray looked at the sky. "Exactly." By afternoon, Evelyn began cutting the driest wheat along the south field. The combine moved steadily, feeding grain into the tank while dust rolled behind her in long brown clouds. For several hours, the rhythm calmed her. This was work she understood. Forward, watch the header, check the gauges, turn at the edge, keep moving. Problems became numbers instead of feelings. Acres completed, fuel remaining, moisture readings, bushels per hour. Near sunset, Hannah climbed into the cab with 2 sandwiches wrapped in foil. "You need to eat. I'm eating now." "That isn't what I meant." Evelyn took the sandwich anyway. They sat in the idling machine while the wheat outside glowed orange under the falling sun. The farmhouse stood in the distance, smaller than it seemed from the kitchen window. For the first time, Evelyn admitted something she had refused to say aloud. "I'm tired." Hannah did not answer immediately. "You've been doing too much alone." "I've done it before." "That doesn't mean you have to keep proving you can." Evelyn looked at the controls. "Everyone keeps saying that lately." "Maybe everyone can see the same thing, that I should quit, that you're allowed to change how you do this." Evelyn thought of Marcus and the lease proposal. "You left Redfield once?" Hannah nodded. "For years." "What made you come back?" Hannah peeled the foil from her sandwich. "Knowing I didn't have to?" Evelyn frowned. "That makes no sense. It made all the difference to me. I needed to know returning was my decision, not my assignment." The words echoed too closely with Luke's. Evelyn looked away. "You think I drove him out?" "I think he needed room to decide who he was. And that meant leaving." "Maybe. And if he never comes back," Hannah looked through the windshield toward the field, "then he can still love you." Evelyn did not respond. She started the combine again before the conversation could go deeper. They worked until the light faded and the grain moisture began climbing with the evening air. Evelyn parked near the machine shed and checked the weather again. The storm window had tightened. 2 days, maybe 3, before conditions turned dangerous. The next morning, she began before sunrise. Ray helped move grain for several hours, then left for his own fields. By noon, the combine had been running almost continuously. The engine temperature climbed once, then settled after Evelyn reduced speed. She ignored the warning. Every acre mattered. Marcus stopped at the edge of the field and waited until she came around. "You still thinking about next season?" he asked when she climbed down. "I'm trying to finish this one." "The lease offer stands. So does my answer." Marcus nodded. "Fair enough." He looked toward the standing wheat. "But don't confuse keeping the land with doing everything yourself." Evelyn had no patience left for another version of the same advice. She climbed back into the cab. By late afternoon, fatigue had settled into her shoulders and wrists. The western sky had begun developing the pale, hazy color that often came before a weather change. Evelyn pushed harder. The combine moved into another pass. Halfway across the field, a warning light flickered. She checked the gauges. Engine temperature was high again. She slowed. The light disappeared. "Come on," she whispered. The machine continued for another 100 yards. Then the header shuddered. Evelyn stopped immediately. The engine still ran, but when she tried to engage the header again, nothing happened. She disengaged, waited, and tried once more. The engine answered with a steady roar. The header remained dead. Evelyn stared through the windshield at rows of wheat still standing ahead of her. In the distance, clouds were beginning to build over the western horizon. Ray reached the field before sunset and climbed beneath the combine with a flashlight, while Evelyn stood beside the front tire watching the western sky darken. He emerged 20 minutes later with grease on both hands and an expression she did not want to see. "Drive system for the header," he said. "The damaged part finally gave out." "Can you fix it?" "Not with what we have." Ray called 2 suppliers. The nearest replacement could not arrive before the storm. Renting another combine was worse. Every available machine within reasonable distance was already working somebody else's wheat. Evelyn looked across the acres still standing. "How much do I have left?" Ray hesitated. Too much. She already knew. Hundreds of acres remained. If heavy rain came with strong wind, mature wheat could lodge, shatter, or become too wet to cut for days. Ray offered to bring his combine over when he finished his own ground. "When will that be?" "If nothing breaks, tomorrow night." The forecast moved up. "I know," Evelyn checked her phone. The storm was now expected sooner than it had been that morning. She calculated what one combine could cover, how much grain still needed hauling, and how much daylight remained. The numbers refused to become hopeful. "Call Luke," Ray said quietly. Evelyn looked at him. "Why?" "Because he's your son. He lives in Denver, Ray. He can't manufacture a combine. Maybe you don't need him to." Evelyn shook her head. "I'm not calling him because I can't handle harvest." Ray did not argue. He drove her back to the farm while the disabled combine remained stranded near the field edge. That evening, Hannah arrived. She listened as Ray explained the failure, then checked the latest weather forecast. "You may have less than 48 hours. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by acreage figures and repair estimates. "I know." Hannah looked at her phone, then at Evelyn. "Have you told Luke?" "No." "Does he know the combine failed?" "No." Hannah said nothing more. Evelyn did not notice when she stepped outside with her phone a few minutes later. After dark, Evelyn went to Daniel's workshop. If there was any temporary work around, he might have written it somewhere. Daniel had kept maintenance notes everywhere inside manuals, taped to cabinet doors, tucked beneath parts catalogs. Evelyn opened drawers, checked old service binders, and searched the metal cabinet where he stored machine paperwork. She found worn belts, obsolete part numbers, and receipts for equipment they no longer own. No repair solution. Frustrated, she pulled down a cracked binder from the top shelf. Several envelopes slid onto the workbench. One was old and yellowed, with no mailing address across the front. In Daniel's handwriting were the words, Luke, Denver. Evelyn froze. She remembered the note in the maintenance ledger. See envelope. Her hands felt suddenly clumsy as she opened it. Inside were application forms for a technical training program in Denver. Luke's name was typed at the top. Several sections had been filled in by hand. Daniel's handwriting appeared in the margins beside deadlines, tuition figures, and contact numbers. One page contained a checklist: transcripts, references, call Monday, application fee. Evelyn sat down on Daniel's old stool. He had not merely known Luke wanted to leave. He had helped him prepare. A handwritten note from the program thanked Daniel for calling about admission requirements. Evelyn read it twice. For years, she had treated Luke's departure as something that happened after Daniel died, as though grief had broken their son loose from the farm. But Daniel had been helping Luke build another future months before his heart attack. The realization hurt in a place Evelyn could not easily name. She felt excluded, but also ashamed of how obvious the reason now seemed. Daniel had known she would resist. She searched the envelope for more. Beneath the application was a smaller folded sheet, written entirely in Daniel's hand. Before she could open it, her phone rang. It was Hannah. The storm sped up again, she said. They're saying tomorrow night now. Evelyn looked through the workshop window toward the dark fields. I heard. I'm sorry. After the call, Evelyn returned to the folded paper. Her thumb rested on the crease. She could hear Daniel's voice in her head, practical and calm, as if he were still standing somewhere in the workshop telling her not to ignore a warning just because she disliked what it meant. She unfolded the note. The first line was short. Evelyn read it once, then stopped breathing for a moment. The note contained only a few lines, but the first one changed everything Evelyn thought she understood about Daniel. The farm should give him a beginning, not decide his ending. She read the sentence again, then a third time, tracing the shape of Daniel's handwriting with her eyes. Beneath it, he had written that Luke had learned discipline, patience, repair work, weather sense, and responsibility on Mercer Farm. Those things belonged to him whether he stayed or left. Daniel had added one final line: if he comes back, let it be because he chooses it. Evelyn sat alone in the workshop while the storm forecast glowed on her phone. For years, she had remembered Daniel teaching Luke to grease bearings, repair belts, read cloud formations, and drive machinery as preparation for inheritance. Now she saw the same memories differently. Daniel had been preparing their son for adulthood, not assigning him a future. The realization hurt because it required Evelyn to admit that she had turned love into expectation without noticing. She folded the note carefully and carried it into the farmhouse. At the kitchen table, she called Luke. He answered quickly. Mom, I found Dad's envelope. Silence. Okay. I found the application and his note. Luke did not speak for several seconds. Evelyn looked toward the dark window. Your father understood you better than I did. The words came out rougher than she intended. Luke inhaled slowly. Mom, no, let me say this. She held Daniel's note in one hand. I thought keeping the farm meant keeping you here. I thought if you left, then everything your dad and I worked for meant less. It never meant less. I know that now. Another silence, different from the guarded ones that usually filled their calls. Evelyn could hear faint traffic behind Luke's voice, Denver moving around him. I should have told you about the program sooner, he said. Maybe. Evelyn looked down at Daniel's words, but I also made it pretty clear what I wanted to hear. Luke did not disagree. That honesty stung, but she accepted it. The combine broke, she said. Hannah told me. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. So Hannah had called him. The header drive is done. Replacement won't make it in time. How much is left, Luke? How many acres? His tone had changed. Not defensive, practical, familiar. Evelyn gave him the number. He asked how much Ray could cover, what time the storm was expected, how many grain trucks were available, and whether the south fields had already been cut. Evelyn answered each question. It felt unexpectedly like talking to Daniel during harvest planning. But this was Luke, calling from another state, using skills Evelyn had once assumed belonged only to the farm. That's a lot, he said finally. I know. When does the rain start? Tomorrow evening, if the forecast holds. And the wind? Strong enough to flatten some of it. Luke went quiet. Evelyn waited for him to say he was sorry. Instead, he asked, Do you still have Dad's field maps? Yes. Text me pictures. Evelyn almost asked why, but stopped herself. Okay. Before hanging up, she said, I'm not asking you to come back. Luke's voice softened. I know. I mean it. I know, Mom. After the call, Evelyn photographed the field maps and sent them. She slept badly. The forecast shifted again overnight, moving the storm several hours earlier. By 4:30, she was awake and dressed. The broken combine still sat near the field. Ray had promised to bring his machine after finishing his own crop, but Evelyn knew one combine could not clear what remained in time. She made coffee and stood at the kitchen window as dawn began to thin the darkness. Daniel's note lay folded beside the maintenance ledger. For the first time in years, Evelyn did not read it as instructions for Luke. She read it as instructions for herself. Let him choose. Outside, the wheat moved in long waves under a growing southern wind. Evelyn began listing what could still be done. Move trucks, clear storage, prepare the auger, harvest, whatever Ray could reach. She would save as much as possible. If the rest was lost, she would deal with that too. Around 6, she stepped outside and heard an engine on the county road. At first, she assumed it was Ray. Then came another sound behind it, heavier, diesel. Evelyn walked toward the end of the drive. A truck appeared through the early light, followed by another vehicle farther back, then another. She shaded her eyes. The first machine turned onto Mercer property. Behind it, more headlights came over the rise. Evelyn stood still in the road. It was not one engine she was hearing, it was several. The first combine turned into the Mercer driveway with Ray driving. Evelyn recognized his machine immediately, but the second combine behind him was unfamiliar. A grain truck followed, then another pickup towing a fuel trailer. More headlights moved along the county road. Evelyn stood near the gate as engines rolled onto the farm, one after another. Hannah climbed from Ray's pickup and hurried toward her. Before you get mad, she said, I called Luke. I figured that out. He started calling people. Evelyn looked past her. A man stepped down from the unfamiliar combine. Hannah introduced him as Cole Ramsey, who had grown up outside Redfield before moving to Nebraska to farm with his wife's family. Another man, Travis Bell, had gone to school with Luke and now drove trucks out of Wichita. A mechanic named Jordan Price had driven in before dawn to help keep equipment moving. Evelyn recognized some faces only after hearing their names. They were people she remembered as teenagers, young men and women who had left Redfield for jobs, marriages, or opportunities elsewhere. People she had quietly placed in the same category as Luke gone. "They came for this?" Evelyn asked. Hannah nodded toward the standing wheat. "Luke told them what happened." "Where is Luke?" Hannah looked toward the road. A dark pickup was approaching fast enough to trail dust behind it. It slowed at the entrance and pulled beside the machine shed. Luke stepped out. For a second, Evelyn forgot the storm, the broken combine, and the wheat. He looked older than the man who had driven away 3 years earlier, though she knew that was partly because she had not allowed herself to notice the changes during video calls. Luke closed the truck door and walked toward her. "You made good time," she said. It was not what she wanted to say. "Left after we talked." "You drove all night." "Mostly." He glanced toward the fields. "We should get moving." Evelyn nodded. There was no dramatic embrace, no apology in the driveway. Harvest did not leave room for one. Luke unfolded Daniel's field map across the hood of his truck. He divided the remaining acreage into sections and coordinated with Ray, Cole, Hannah, and the drivers. Ray takes the west field. Cole starts north and works down. We keep trucks rotating so nobody waits with a full tank. Evelyn watched him point out access roads and storage capacity from memory. "You remember all this?" she said. Luke looked at her. "I grew up here." The answer landed gently. Not "I belong here," not "I'm coming back," just the truth. He had left, and the farm was still part of him. The machines entered the week shortly after sunrise. 2 working combines cut parallel sections while grain trucks moved between fields and storage. Evelyn drove one of the trucks at first, then helped coordinate unloading. Ray's machine filled quickly. Cole's followed. Dust rose over Mercer Farm in thick clouds, hanging above the fields like smoke. Every hour mattered. The weather forecast showed the storm advancing faster. Wind strengthened through the morning. By noon, clouds were visible far to the west. During a short fuel stop, Evelyn found Luke beside Cole's combine, checking a hydraulic line. He wore an old pair of leather work gloves, darkened with years of use. Evelyn recognized the split seam across the right thumb. Daniel had given Luke those gloves when he was 17. "You kept those?" she asked. Luke looked down. "They still work." Evelyn wanted to say something about Daniel, but a truck horn sounded from the field and Luke immediately turned. "Later," he said. Evelyn nodded. Later, they returned to work. More than once, Evelyn caught herself watching the people who had come. Cole had left Redfield and still knew how to read the field. Travis had left and still remembered which county road gave the easiest access to the north acreage. Jordan had built a career elsewhere, yet he crawled beneath Ray's combine to tighten a loose fitting without being asked twice. Evelyn had spent years telling herself that the younger generation had abandoned places like Redfield. Standing in the middle of the harvest, she saw how incomplete that judgment had been. They had left, that part was true, but leaving had not erased where they came from. By mid-afternoon, the sky had turned gray. Hannah checked radar between loads. "We're running out of time." Luke studied the remaining acreage. "Keep both machines moving." Ray wiped dust from his face. "We can finish if the weather gives us another few hours." The wind pushed harder across the field. Wheat bent in broad waves ahead of the combines. Evelyn drove another loaded truck toward storage, unloaded, and returned. The final field remained partly standing. Luke climbed into the passenger side. "You okay?" he asked. "Ask me after the last acre." For the first time that day, he smiled. "Fair." They reached the field as Ray and Cole turned for another pass. A dark wall of cloud now covered the western horizon. Evelyn stepped from the truck and smelled rain before she felt it. One cold drop struck the back of her hand. Then another darkened the dust beside her boot. Luke looked toward the remaining wheat. The last field was not finished. The rain began as scattered drops, darkening the dust around Evelyn's boots while Ray and Cole kept the combines moving. No one stopped. Luke climbed into the cab with Cole long enough to check a warning light, then jumped back down and waved the next grain truck forward. The final field had narrowed to several long strips of standing wheat, but the storm was now close enough that thunder rolled across the western horizon. Evelyn drove one load to storage, unloaded, and returned as quickly as the road allowed. By then the wind had strengthened. Wheat bent hard in one direction, then shivered upright again. "How much?" she asked Luke. He checked the field map. "Less than 40 acres. Can they finish if nothing else breaks?" As if the farm had heard him. Ray's combine slowed near the north edge. Luke ran toward it. Evelyn followed in the truck. A belt had begun slipping under load. Not a major failure yet, but enough to cost precious minutes. Luke opened the side panel and examined the tensioner. Ray leaned out of the cab. "I can limp it and burn the belt?" Luke said, "Give me 5 minutes." "You have 3. Luke pulled tools from the service box. Evelyn watched him work quickly, hands moving with the confidence of someone who understood machines deeply. He adjusted the tension, replaced a worn fastener with one Jordan had brought, and signaled Ray to test it. The mechanism engaged cleanly. Ray grinned. "Denver teach you that, Luke?" Wiped his hands on the old gloves Daniel had given him. "Kansas started it." The answer stayed with Evelyn as the combine rolled back into the wheat. Skills she had once believed belonged to Mercer Farm had traveled with Luke. The farm had not lost them when he left. It had given them to him. Rain increased to a light, steady patter. Cole finished one strip and turned into another. Trucks rotated without waiting. Hannah stood near the field entrance, watching radar and shouting updates over the engines. "Heavy cell is 20 minutes out." Evelyn looked at the remaining wheat. 20 minutes. Ray's combine emptied into Travis's truck while still moving. Cole took the final southern pass. Luke directed Evelyn to bring the last empty truck alongside Ray. They worked without conversation now. Every movement reduced to necessity. The rain thickened. Dust turned dark against the tires. Evelyn watched the grain level rise in the truck bed and thought of all the mornings she had told herself she was protecting this farm alone. Nothing about this harvest was alone. The final standing strip lay near the eastern fence. Ray and Cole approached it from opposite ends. Wind drove the rain sideways. Evelyn held her breath as both headers moved through the last wheat. A minute later, Cole lifted his header. Ray did the same. The field was cut. Luke slapped the side of the truck. "Go!" Evelyn drove toward storage with the last load as rain finally came hard enough to blur the windshield. By the time she backed beneath the auger, water streamed from the roof of the truck cab. The wheat was inside. Not every kernel was perfect. Some acres had been cut wetter than they wanted, but the crop was out of the field before the worst of the storm arrived. That evening, everyone gathered briefly in the barn while rain hammered the metal roof. Ray and the others left in stages, needing to get home before roads worsened. Evelyn thanked each of them and felt embarrassed by how inadequate the words sounded. Eventually, only Luke remained. He stood near the workbench, still wearing Daniel's gloves. The barn felt strangely quiet after the machines. Evelyn sat on an overturned bucket. "Why did you really leave?" she asked. Luke looked at her. "You know why." "I know what we said that night." "I'm asking what you were afraid of." Luke took off the gloves slowly. "That if I stayed, I'd wake up at 40 and not know whether I had chosen any of it." Evelyn said nothing. "I loved Dad. I loved this place. I even liked parts of the work, but every time you talked about the future, it was already decided." my job, my house, my life. He looked toward the open barn door where rain fell beyond the light. I started feeling like the only way to find out who I was to leave completely. Evelyn swallowed. I made you think staying was the price of belonging here. Luke met her eyes. Yeah. The word hurt, but she did not defend herself. I'm sorry. Luke looked down at the gloves in his hands. I know you were grieving. That doesn't make it right. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Luke sat across from her. The distance between them felt smaller than it had in years. Not because he had come home, but because Evelyn had finally stopped asking him to become someone else. Rain continued against the roof. I don't know what happens to the farm now, she said. I can't run all 640 acres like this forever. Luke nodded. Maybe keeping it doesn't have to mean doing it the same way Dad did. The storm passed before dawn, leaving the fields dark, flattened in places, and shining beneath a pale Kansas sky. Evelyn walked the edge of the harvested ground with mud clinging to her boots and felt something she had not expected after such a difficult season. Relief. Without triumph, the wheat was safe in storage. But the farm had not suddenly become easier to run. The combine still needed repairs. Fuel costs remained high. The labor shortage would return next year. Saving one harvest had solved the immediate crisis, not the larger problem. For the first time, Evelyn was willing to admit that without treating the admission as failure. 2 days later, she asked Marcus Reed to come back. Hannah joined them at the kitchen table with maps, projected costs, and several lease options. Marcus explained that a younger farmer nearby was looking for more acreage and could lease most of the 640 acres while Evelyn retained ownership. She could keep the farmhouse, the machine shed, and a smaller section of ground close to home. She could still participate in long-term planning without carrying the entire operational burden herself. Months earlier, Evelyn would have heard only one word: surrender. Now she heard choices. The land stays Mercer land, she asked, unless you decide otherwise. Marcus said, you're leasing the right to farm it, not giving it away. Hannah slid one of the plans toward her. You can change the arrangement later if you need to. Evelyn studied the boundaries. The field where Daniel had taught Luke to drive a tractor would still be hers. So would the house, the barn, and the land around them. The rest could remain productive without requiring Evelyn to prove she could outwork time itself. I want to think about it, she said. Marcus smiled. That's already more than you said last time. Luke stayed in Redfield several more days. He helped Ray finish small repairs, checked the broken combine, and replaced a damaged sensor before leaving. On his final morning, Evelyn found him in the machine shed tightening a bracket near the header. You know you don't have to fix everything before you go, she said. Luke looked up. I know. He finished the bolt anyway. Later, while loading his bag into the truck, Evelyn handed him Daniel's folded note. Luke read the line again. The farm should give him a beginning, not decide his ending. Dad said something like this to me once. He said, Evelyn waited. He told me, if you come back because you choose it. Evelyn looked toward the wheat fields. I wish he'd told me. Luke leaned against the truck. He probably thought you'd figure it out. Your father had too much confidence in people. Luke laughed softly. Evelyn did too. Then the laughter faded, and she said, I kept thinking he chose you over the farm. Luke shook his head. He never did. Evelyn understood now. Daniel had never seen love as a contest between land and sun. He could want the farm to survive and still want Luke free to leave it. The contradiction had existed only in Evelyn's mind. When Luke climbed into the truck, she felt the old panic rise for a second. Denver. Distance. Another departure. She could have asked when he was coming back. Instead, she said, drive safe. Luke looked at her through the open window. I will. And call when you get there. I always do. He paused. Mom? Yeah, I'm not disappearing. Evelyn nodded. I know. This time she meant it. By winter. Mercer Farm operated under the new arrangement. Evelyn leased most of the acreage to a younger farmer from the county while keeping the farmhouse, buildings, and a smaller section of land under her direct care. She still checked weather before sunrise. She still walked fields and argued about equipment maintenance. But she no longer began every day with the burden of proving the farm would collapse without her. Luke returned to Denver and kept his job. He called more often, sometimes from his apartment, sometimes from a noisy workshop. He came back for a weekend in early spring and left again on Sunday evening. No promises were made about taking over the farm. Evelyn noticed how much easier that made his visits. They could talk about the place without turning every conversation into a negotiation over his future. Redfield itself did not reverse course. Young people still left, the school still worried about enrollment, some farms sold, others consolidated or leased acreage. Hannah continued advising families through transitions that older generations sometimes resisted. Evelyn stopped treating every departure as betrayal. She had seen what happened during harvest. Cole came from Nebraska. Travis drove in from Wichita. Jordan brought tools before sunrise. Luke drove through the night from Denver. They had left Redfield, but when someone needed them, the road still ran both ways. One late afternoon, months after the storm. Evelyn stood at the edge of the field nearest the farmhouse. The young farmer leasing the larger acreage had finished planting for the season. The ground stretched dark and even beneath the evening light. Her phone rang. Luke. How's Denver? She asked. Busy. How's the farm? Also busy. Just less dramatically. He told her about a difficult project at work. Evelyn told him about planting plans and how Hannah had convinced Marcus to stop using 3 spreadsheets when one would do. They talked for 20 minutes. Neither asked when Luke would move back. Before hanging up, he said, Love you, Mom. Evelyn smiled toward the horizon. Love you too. Drive down when you can. After the call, she walked past the machine shed and climbed into the repaired combine. Daniel's old maintenance ledger rested in the storage compartment. On the passenger side lay the leather work gloves Luke had worn during the community harvest. The same pair Daniel had given him years ago. Luke had forgotten them when he left. Evelyn picked them up, turned them over once, then set them back exactly where they were. She did not carry them into the house. She did not treat them as evidence that Luke was destined to become a farmer. They were simply his gloves, waiting in a place that still belonged to him whenever he chose to return. Outside. Mercer Farm remained in the family. The wheat would grow again. Machines would break again. Weather would change. People would leave and come back in ways Evelyn could not control. For most of her life, she had believed legacy meant keeping the land and the family arranged in the same pattern forever. Now she understood something Daniel had understood first. The land could belong to the family without the family belonging to the land.